My parents' wedding anniversary was supposed to be a celebration. Golden lights, familiar laughter, and the kind of speeches that polish the past until it shines. I wore a simple dress and carried a quiet hope that this night might finally feel warm. Instead, it became the night I learned exactly where I stood, in a room full of relatives and strangers. My name, Amelia, was turned into a punchline, my life reduced to a cautionary tale told from a microphone. I smiled through the sting because that's what I'd always done. But when the applause came, I realized something inside me had gone cold and clear. I wasn't leaving the party, I was leaving them. The invitation arrived thick and glossy, embossed in gold like a promise that had learned how to shine. Amelia held it between her fingers longer than necessary, reading the words again and again. 40 years together, Richard and Elaine, as if repetition might soften the ache they stirred. A wedding anniversary was meant to celebrate endurance, devotion, and family, and yet the weight in her chest suggested something else entirely. She had learned early that milestones in her family didn't heal old wounds. They pressed on them, carefully, publicly, until they throbbed. Still, she told herself this time would be different. People said that about time the way they said it about weather, inevitable, uncontrollable, and somehow always improving. She chose a dress that wouldn't draw attention, packed a small gift she'd spent too long choosing, and rehearsed a polite smile that would pass for peace. The venue was a restored ballroom with chandeliers that scattered light like confetti, tables dressed in linen so white they looked untouched by reality. Amelia arrived early, as she always did, because being punctual was one of the few virtues she'd perfected in a household where perfection was demanded and rarely acknowledged. Her father, Richard, stood near the stage, already in host mode, shaking hands and laughing too loudly, the same laugh he used when he wanted the room to know he was in control. Her mother, Elaine, floated between guests with practiced grace, accepting compliments as if they were owed. They looked flawless together, well-dressed, admired, certain. Amelia watched them from a distance and felt that familiar split inside herself, the daughter who wanted to belong and the woman who knew better than to expect it. Family members filtered in with warm greetings that skimmed the surface. Aunts commented on Amelia's appearance, cousins asked polite questions about work, and everyone seemed eager to place her neatly into a category that made sense to them. She could feel the comparisons before they were spoken, especially when her sister Claire arrived. Claire, radiant and effortless, slid into the room like she'd never once questioned her place in it. She hugged their parents first, then Amelia, a brief squeeze accompanied by a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Amelia told herself not to read into it, told herself she was imagining the old hierarchies, the unspoken rankings that had shaped their childhood like invisible walls. As the room filled, memories crowded in too, smaller anniversaries, birthdays where Amelia's achievements were footnotes and her mistakes were center stage, dinners where silence was safer than honesty. She remembered being told she was too sensitive, too ambitious, too different, as if difference were a flaw instead of a fact. Those lessons had burrowed deep, resurfacing now as she stood among strangers who knew her only through stories filtered by her parents' approval or disappointment. She wondered how many times her name had been used in her absence, how often her life had been summarized with a sigh. Ethan arrived just before the music started, his presence steadying in a way that felt almost unreal. He squeezed her hand, asked if she was okay, and she nodded because explaining would take more words than the moment allowed. With him beside her, the room felt less overwhelming, but the knot in her stomach remained. She watched her parents take their seats of honor, watched the guests turn toward them with admiration, and felt the old wound stir. Not sharp yet, but awake. This was their night, she reminded herself, and she was here to support them, to be gracious, to prove, perhaps foolishly, that she could still show up without expecting to be hurt. The lights dimmed slightly, glasses were filled, and a hush settled over the room as the first toast was announced. Amelia straightened her posture, smoothed her dress, and inhaled slowly, unaware that the evening she'd hoped would pass quietly was already leaning toward her, carrying years of unspoken judgment wrapped in celebration, waiting for the exact moment when everyone would be listening. The clink of a spoon against glass cut through the soft music like a signal flare, and Amelia felt her shoulders tense before her mind could catch up. Her father rose first, straightening his jacket as the room turned toward him with affectionate attention. Richard had always known how to command a crowd. His voice carried confidence, humor, and just enough warmth to make people lean in. He began with the expected stories: how he'd met Elaine, how they'd struggled in the early years, how love and sacrifice had carried them through. Laughter rippled across the tables at the right moments, applause landing on cue, and Amelia allowed herself to breathe, telling herself that this would be harmless, that she was overthinking, that not every spotlight was aimed at her. Then Richard's smile shifted almost imperceptibly into something sharper. He spoke about family, about children, about the different paths people choose, and Amelia felt a tightening in her chest as if her name had already been spoken. He gestured toward Claire, praising her stability, her sensible decisions, the way she'd made them proud without ever having to explain herself. The room responded with approving nods, and Amelia clapped along, her palms stinging slightly, her smile fixed in place. She told herself this was normal, that parents compared without meaning harm, that this wasn't about her. But when Richard's eyes found her across the room, the air seemed to thin. He laughed lightly and said her name, stretching it just enough to draw attention, and suddenly every face turned. Amelia felt the heat rise in her cheeks as he spoke about her independent spirit, the way she'd always insisted on doing things her own way, as if stubbornness were a charming quirk instead of a flaw. The words were coated in humor, delivered with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to make criticism sound like affection. He mentioned her career as if it were a phase, her choices as if they were amusing detours, and with each sentence the laughter grew louder. Amelia's heart pounded, not from anger yet, but from the old, familiar humiliation of being reduced to a story that wasn't hers. Elaine took the microphone next, her tone softer but no less precise. She spoke about motherhood, about the challenges of raising different kinds of children, her gaze resting on Amelia with a smile that felt like a verdict. She said she'd worried about Amelia's future, about her tendency to dream too big, to love too freely, to resist guidance. The room murmured sympathetically, and Amelia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. These weren't new criticisms. They were echoes of conversations held behind closed doors, now amplified and shared like party favors. The fact that they were being delivered as jokes made them land harder, because laughter left no room for objection. Amelia glanced at Claire, hoping for a sign, an eye roll, a shake of the head, anything that said, "This isn't okay." Claire's expression was composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her smile polite and distant. It was the same look she'd worn their entire lives when Amelia took the brunt of their parents' disappointment. The silence felt like agreement, and that realization hurt more than the words themselves. Around them, relatives chuckled, strangers whispered, and someone raised a glass in her direction as if she were in on the joke. She became acutely aware of her body, of how still she was sitting, of the way her jaw ached from holding her smile in place. Her mind raced through responses she would never say, defenses she'd learned to swallow years ago. Correcting them here would only make her seem ungrateful, dramatic, or humorless. She had been taught that enduring was preferable to objecting, that gratitude was measured by how much one could tolerate. So she stayed quiet, her laughter a half-second late, her applause mechanical, while something inside her slowly detached. Ethan leaned closer, his hand brushing hers under the table, a silent question in the gesture. Amelia didn't look at him, afraid that if she did, the careful balance she was maintaining would shatter. The speeches wound down, applause swelled, and Richard and Elaine beamed, basking in admiration, unaware or unconcerned with the cost of their entertainment. Amelia sat there, surrounded by people and yet profoundly alone, realizing with startling clarity that this humiliation wasn't accidental or thoughtless. It was familiar, rehearsed, and accepted as tradition, and for the first time, she understood that surviving it had never been the same as consenting to it. When the applause finally faded and the room returned to its soft hum of conversation, Amelia felt as though she were moving through water, every step heavier than the last. The humiliation still rang in her ears, not as a single moment, but as a chorus of small wounds layered over years of similar ones. She told herself to focus on the practical things: smiles, small talk, the neutral safety of the buffet line, but her attention kept drifting back to one person. Claire stood a few tables away, laughing with an aunt, her posture relaxed, her face untroubled, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. That calm, effortless composure was what had always set her apart, the mark of someone who had never needed to fight for space. Growing up, Claire had been the example held up for comparison, the child whose achievements were spoken of with pride and whose mistakes were quietly managed. She knew the rules of their family instinctively: when to speak, when to stay silent, how to align herself with their parents' expectations without appearing to try. Amelia, by contrast, had learned those rules through correction, through the sharp edges of disappointment, and the constant reminder that love was conditional. Watching Claire now, Amelia felt that old imbalance resurface, not as jealousy, but as a tired recognition of roles that had never truly changed. Amelia drifted closer, drawn by a need she hadn't fully acknowledged. She wanted Claire to say something, anything that would acknowledge what had just happened. An apology on their parents' behalf, a quiet validation, even a look that said, "I saw it too." Instead, Claire's laughter continued, her voice light, her attention fixed on the conversation in front of her. When she finally noticed Amelia, her smile flickered briefly, then settled back into place. She asked if Amelia was enjoying the party, her tone pleasant, detached, as if the evening were unfolding exactly as planned. The question landed harder than the speeches had. Amelia searched Claire's face for some hint of discomfort, some sign that the public ridicule had crossed a line for her as well. There was none. Claire spoke about the decor, the food, how happy their parents seemed, her words carefully neutral, safely distant from anything that might disrupt the celebration. Amelia realized then that this wasn't ignorance, it was choice. Silence, in this family, was a currency, and Claire had always known when to spend it to maintain her position. Amelia remembered countless moments from their childhood that suddenly felt connected. Times when Claire had been present for the criticism, but absent from the defense, when she looked away just as their parents' words sharpened. At the time, Amelia had excused it as fear, as self-preservation, as something she herself might have done in Claire's place. Standing there now, surrounded by the polished glow of the anniversary party, that generosity felt misplaced. Silence, she realized, wasn't neutral when it protected cruelty. It was an endorsement wrapped in politeness. Claire excused herself to greet another guest, her hand briefly touching Amelia's arm in a gesture that might have passed for affection to anyone else. Amelia watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of grief and clarity. The golden child wasn't cruel, not openly, not deliberately, but she benefited from the cruelty all the same, from the way it redirected attention, lowered expectations, and reinforced her own standing. By saying nothing, Claire preserved the story their parents had told the room, the story in which Amelia was a cautionary contrast, the example of what happened when one strayed too far from the approved path. As the evening wore on, Amelia noticed how easily people gravitated toward Claire, how naturally she fit into the role her parents had designed for her. Compliments flowed her way, inquiries about her life met with approval, her presence reinforcing the narrative of a successful, harmonious family. Amelia, meanwhile, felt increasingly invisible, reduced to the caricature introduced during the toasts. The difference between them had never felt so stark or so final. Ethan returned to her side, concern evident in his eyes, and Amelia realized she had been holding her breath. She didn't need to explain what Claire's silence meant. The understanding settled quietly inside her. This wasn't about one night or one speech. It was about years of unspoken alignment, about the cost of belonging in a family that required someone else to be diminished for balance, and about the moment Amelia accepted that waiting for her sister to speak up was another way of asking to be heard again. Ethan didn't rush her, didn't pull her away, or fill the silence with questions that would demand answers she wasn't ready to give. He stood beside Amelia as if his presence alone could steady the ground beneath her feet, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, a quiet anchor amid the noise of the celebration. That simple, wordless support felt radically different from the love she'd grown up with. the kind that announced itself loudly but withdrew the moment it was challenged. With Ethan, there was no performance, no audience. There was only the steady reassurance that she didn't have to earn her place. When they moved toward the edge of the room, away from the laughter and clinking glasses, Ethan finally spoke. He asked if she wanted to leave, not in a way that assumed weakness or escape, but as an option offered with respect. Amelia hesitated, her instincts pulling her in opposite directions. The part of her shaped by years of family conditioning urged her to stay, to endure, to prove she could take a joke and rise above it. Another part, quieter but growing stronger, recognized the toll that endurance had taken. Ethan didn't pressure her either way. He simply waited, his gaze steady, his patience a contrast to the urgency and judgment she just endured. Amelia felt tears threaten, surprising her with their suddenness. She turned slightly, embarrassed by the vulnerability, but Ethan didn't look away. He told her softly that what had happened wasn't okay, that humor didn't excuse humiliation, and that being someone's child didn't give them the right to strip her of dignity. Hearing those words spoken aloud was disorienting. They named something she'd spent years minimizing, reframing, and swallowing. Validation, she realized, could feel almost painful when you weren't used to receiving it. She thought about the countless times she'd defended her parents to friends, explaining away their remarks as generational differences or tough love. She'd done it so often that the explanations had begun to feel like truth. Ethan's refusal to participate in that narrative cracked something open. He wasn't angry on her behalf in a way that demanded confrontation. He was clear, calm, and unwavering. His love didn't ask her to be stronger or quieter. It asked her to be honest about what she felt. They stood there together, watching the party continue without them, and Amelia noticed how little anyone seemed to notice their absence. The realization was both sobering and freeing. She had spent so much of her life performing resilience, believing that her presence was necessary to maintain the illusion of family harmony. Ethan's hand tightened gently around hers, grounding her in the present rather than the expectations of the past. He told her she didn't owe anyone her pain, that leaving didn't make her dramatic or disloyal, that choosing herself was not an act of cruelty. In that moment, Amelia understood that love could be protective without being possessive, supportive without being conditional. Ethan wasn't trying to rescue her or rewrite her family history. He was offering her a choice, one she'd rarely been given. The simplicity of it was startling. Stay if you want, leave if you need. Either way, you're not wrong. The permission settled into her bones, easing a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw a future that didn't require her to shrink. The contrast between his quiet certainty and her parents' public performance sharpened her resolve. Love, she realized, didn't have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it spoke in calm sentences, in patient silences, in the courage to name harm without demanding revenge. As the music swelled again and another round of laughter erupted from the center of the room, Amelia felt a clarity she'd never experienced before. With Ethan beside her, she wasn't abandoning anything of value. She was recognizing where her worth had always been seen and where it never would be. And for the first time that night, the idea of walking away didn't feel like loss. It felt like truth. The decision didn't arrive as a dramatic surge of anger or a sudden confrontation. It settled into Amelia slowly, with the calm certainty of something long overdue. She felt it as she stood there beside Ethan, listening to the distant rhythm of music and laughter that no longer reached her in the same way. The party continued, perfectly intact without her participation, and that realization stripped the moment of its last illusion. Whatever role she believed she played in her family's story, it had never required her presence, only her compliance. The clarity was quiet, almost gentle, and that gentleness made it impossible to ignore. Amelia straightened her shoulders and took a final look at the room. The chandeliers still glowed, casting warm light over smiling faces, over her parents at the center of it all, basking in admiration and applause. Richard leaned in close to Elaine, laughing at something someone had said, his pride unmistakable. They looked content, unburdened, as if the evening had unfolded exactly as they'd hoped. Amelia searched their faces for any flicker of awareness, any sign that they sensed the fracture they'd created, but there was nothing. In that absence, something inside her released its grip. She didn't announce her departure. There was no need to draw attention to herself now, not when she had spent years being too visible in all the wrong ways. She picked up her bag, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if acknowledging the significance of the act without dramatizing it. Ethan stayed close, matching her pace, offering presence without commentary. Together, they moved through the room, past clusters of guests who were deep in conversation, past relatives who barely registered her passing. Each step felt both heavy and light, burdened by history yet buoyed by resolve. As they neared the exit, Amelia felt a familiar urge rise. The instinct to explain, to soften, to leave behind a version of herself that would be remembered kindly. She imagined turning back, offering a polite excuse, smoothing over discomfort the way she always had. The habit was deeply ingrained, a reflex honed over decades, but she recognized it now for what it was, another form of self-erasure. She let the urge pass, allowing silence to do what words never had. The cool air outside hit her skin like a reset. The noise of the ballroom dulled behind closed doors, replaced by the quiet hum of the night. Amelia paused for a moment, her hand on the handle, her breath unsteady. This threshold felt different from any she'd crossed before. Leaving a party was simple. Leaving a pattern, a role, a lifetime of expectation was something else entirely. She realized she wasn't just stepping away from a celebration. She was stepping out of a story that had been written without her consent. Ethan asked if she was sure, his voice low, careful not to rush her. Amelia nodded, surprised by the steadiness of the gesture. Certainty didn't feel like triumph or relief. It felt like alignment, like her body and mind finally agreeing on something important. She didn't need closure in the form of confrontation or apology. The act of leaving, of choosing not to endure one more moment of sanctioned disrespect was closure enough. They walked toward the car, the night open and unremarkable, and Amelia felt the weight of what she was doing settle fully onto her shoulders. There would be consequences, questions, accusations, rewritten narratives in which her absence would be framed as cruelty or ingratitude. She knew the cost of refusing to play her assigned role, and yet, with each step away from the venue, that cost felt more bearable than the price she'd been paying to stay. Before getting in, Amelia glanced back once, not at the building itself, but at what it represented. A family bound by image, a love measured in compliance, a history she had carried longer than she should have. She didn't feel hatred or even anger, only a deep, steady resolve. This was not a temporary retreat or a dramatic pause meant to provoke change. It was a decision made in full awareness, a boundary drawn without malice, and as the door closed behind her, Amelia understood that some departures are not meant to be explained, only honored. The days after the anniversary passed with a strange, unfamiliar quiet, as if Amelia had stepped into a version of life where the constant background noise of anticipation and self-defense no longer existed. There were no immediate phone calls from her parents, no messages demanding explanations or offering apologies. The silence felt intentional, heavy with the same unspoken rules she had grown up with. For the first time, Amelia didn't rush to fill it. She let the absence sit, noticing how her body slowly began to unclench, how mornings felt less urgent without the expectation of emotional labor waiting on the other end of the line. In the space created by distance, memories surfaced with new clarity. Amelia began to see her past not as a series of personal failures, but as a pattern she had been conditioned to accept. Moments that once confused her now made sense. The praise that always came with conditions, the affection that cooled when she asserted herself, the way love had been rationed according to obedience. This reframing was painful, but it was also liberating. Understanding the shape of the wound allowed her to stop reopening it in the hope that this time it might heal differently. Ethan became a quiet constant in this new chapter, not as a solution, but as a witness. He listened as Amelia spoke through memories she had never fully named before, never interrupting, never rushing her toward forgiveness or closure. With him, she practiced saying no without apology, expressing hurt without cushioning it, acknowledging anger without turning it inward. These were small acts, almost invisible from the outside, but they reshaped her sense of self more profoundly than any grand declaration ever could. Amelia also began to notice how much energy she now had for things that had once been sidelined. She poured herself into her work with renewed focus, no longer measuring her success by whether it might finally earn her parents' approval. Friendships deepened as she allowed herself to be fully present rather than preoccupied with family obligations that drained her. She learned to recognize the difference between relationships that demanded endurance and those that offered reciprocity, and that distinction slowly guided her choices. There were moments of doubt, of course. Late at night, the old questions crept in, whether she had been too harsh, whether leaving without explanation had been unfair, whether time might soften things enough to make reconciliation possible. Instead of pushing those thoughts away, Amelia examined them with curiosity. She realized they were echoes of a voice that had always prioritized harmony over honesty. Choosing distance didn't erase love, it simply acknowledged that love without respect was unsustainable. As weeks turned into months, Amelia felt her identity shifting, loosening from the roles she'd been assigned. She was no longer the difficult daughter, the cautionary tale, the one whose life was discussed rather than understood. She was simply herself, a woman learning to trust her own perceptions. That trust didn't come all at once. It grew through repetition. Each boundary kept, each moment of self-betrayal avoided, each decision made with her own well-being in mind.